The fluorescent lights inside Mercy General's emergency waiting room never fully flickered off, and they never fully settled either. They just hummed, a low, steady, indifferent sound that filled the room the way cold air fills a space nobody bothered to heat. It was 11:47 on a Friday night in October, and outside Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October, pushing rain sideways against every window it could find, rattling the glass in its frames, reminding everyone inside that the world beyond those walls was not a place you wanted to be right now. Rebecca Calloway had been on her feet for 8 hours before she sat down in that waiting room. 8 hours of the night shift in the intensive care unit, 2 floors up, checking vitals, adjusting lines, talking to patients who hadn't slept in days and were too afraid to say so out loud. She was still in her scrubs, navy blue, worn soft, from too many washes, a small fraying at the left cuff she kept meaning to fix. Her sneakers were the kind that had once had good support and now just had memory. She had pulled her hair back at the start of her shift and hadn't touched it since. A few strands had come loose, and she hadn't noticed. She noticed everything else, though. That was the thing about Rebecca. 8 years of night shifts had rewired something in her. She could read a room the way other people read a clock, one quick look, and she knew who was in pain, who was scared, who was trying not to show it. The waiting room at 11:47 was all three. A man in a construction jacket held a bag of frozen peas against his wrist and stared at the wall. An older woman 2 seats down had her rosary wrapped around both hands and her lips moving without sound. A teenage boy near the vending machine kept checking the door to the treatment area, his knee bouncing a rhythm nobody else could hear. Rebecca took all of it in without meaning to. Then she looked down at the small body leaning against her left side. Lily was 5 years old, and she was asleep, the way only children can sleep, in impossible places, completely without apology. Her cheek pressed flat against her mother's arm, her mouth slightly open, her breath coming in the slow, even rhythm of someone who had decided the world could wait. She was wearing the sweatshirt with the yellow duck on the front, the one she refused to let Rebecca wash more than once a week, because she was convinced washing it too much would make the duck disappear. Her shoes were on the wrong feet. Rebecca had noticed at Mrs. Dempsey's apartment when she picked her up, and Lily had insisted they were fine that way. Rebecca shifted slightly, so Lily's head had a better angle against her shoulder. She did it without looking the automatic adjustment of a woman who had learned to move around her daughter's comfort, the way water moves around stone. Her other hand was resting on her knee, and in that hand was a piece of paper. Not just any piece of paper, the kind that arrives in a plain white envelope with a corporate logo in the upper left corner and language so careful and so deliberately neutral that it takes you 2 full reads to understand what it's actually saying. Rebecca had read it 4 times. She understood it perfectly now. Hargrove Health Insurance. A name printed at the top in clean navy letters above a tagline about comprehensive care and trusted coverage. Below that, a reference number. Below that, a date. Below that, the words she had been trying to find a way around for 3 days. After careful review of the submitted documentation, we regret to inform you that the requested procedure does not meet the criteria for medical necessity, as defined under your current plan. Lily's heart surgery. Denied. The paper had a crease down the middle from where Rebecca had folded it and unfolded it so many times that the crease had gone soft. She didn't fold it again now. She just held it the way you hold something you haven't decided what to do with yet, but aren't ready to put down. The surgery had been recommended 4 months ago by Lily's cardiologist, a careful and deliberate woman named Dr. Okafor, who did not use words like urgent unless she meant them. She had used that word. She had also used the phrase window of optimal intervention, which was a medical way of saying that the right time to act was not a moving target, it was a fixed point, and that point was getting closer. Rebecca had filed the insurance claim the same week. She had submitted every form, every note, every scan Dr. Okafor had provided. She had followed up twice by phone. She had been told both times that the claim was under review. 3 days ago, the envelope arrived. She looked at Lily, at the slow rise and fall of her small chest, at the way her fingers curled loosely around the strap of Rebecca's bag, even in sleep, holding on without knowing she was doing it. Rebecca had been a nurse long enough to understand what denial letters meant in practice. They meant you started over, you filed an appeal, you gathered more documentation, you waited again. And while you waited, the window Dr. Okafor had described kept narrowing, and the child on your shoulder kept breathing in that slow, even trusting way, completely unaware that someone in an office building somewhere had looked at her file and decided it didn't meet their criteria. The waiting room hummed around her. The man with the frozen peas shifted in his seat. The older woman's lips kept moving. The teenage boy near the vending machine finally stopped watching the door and let his head fall back against the wall. Rebecca folded the letter once, carefully along the existing crease, and tucked it into the front pocket of her bag. She rested her head back against the wall behind her and closed her eyes for exactly one moment, the kind of moment that isn't rest, just the brief pause a person takes when they need to remind themselves that they are still standing even when they're sitting down. Then she opened them again, and that was when she heard it. From somewhere near the entrance, cutting cleanly through the hum of the fluorescent lights, in the muffled sound of rain against glass, the sharp, deliberate sound of heels on a hard floor. Not hurried, not uncertain, the kind of footsteps that expected the room to move out of their way. The perfume arrived first. It moved through the waiting room ahead of her, the way an announcement moves through a crowd. Not loud, not asking permission, simply present in a way that made the air around it feel different. It was the kind of fragrance that didn't come from a department store counter, the kind that came from a small bottle with no price tag visible because the price was never the point. The point was that you knew. You always knew. Then came the coat, camel-colored, draped over her shoulders, rather than worn, because wearing a coat implied you had needed it. A bag on her left arm, dark cognac leather, structured with hardware that caught the waiting room's fluorescent light and threw it back like a small, quiet argument. The diamond on her left hand did the same thing every time her fingers moved. Diane Hargrove was 43 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning not in any classroom, but in the particular school of rooms that rearrange themselves around certain people, that the way you enter a space determines everything that happens inside it. She had mastered the entrance the way some people master a language, fluently, automatically, without thinking about it anymore. She paused just inside the sliding doors, not because she was uncertain, because she was taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the waiting room, the way a hotel guest's eyes move across a room that is not up to standard, noting, cataloging, deciding. The plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows. The vending machine with a handwritten out-of-order sign taped over the coffee option. The television mounted high on the wall, cycling through a local news segment, with the volume set too low to follow. The people in the chairs, a man with something wrapped around his wrist, an older woman with her head bent, a teenager who looked like he hadn't slept since Thursday, and the smell of the place, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that no amount of cleaning product had ever fully covered. The particular smell of a building where people came when they had run out of other options. Diane's assistant, a young woman in her mid-20s, who had been hired 6 months ago and had already learned that her primary job function was anticipatory agreement, moved to the check-in desk without being asked. Diane herself did not move toward the desk. She moved toward the seating area, slowly in the way of a woman who understood that moving slowly in a room where everyone else was waiting was its own kind of statement. She chose a path along the far wall, in the far corner of the waiting room, in the chair closest to the hallway that led back toward the treatment area. A man sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped being young a long time ago, but had found something better on the other side of it, settled, attentive, the face of someone who had spent decades listening to things that mattered, and had learned to be quiet about what he heard. His jacket was good, but not new. His tie was loosened at the collar, the knot pulled an inch down from where it had started the day. A paper coffee cup sat on the floor beside his right shoe, long since empty. This was Jonathan Marsh, the chief of medicine at Mercy General. Though nothing about the way he was sitting would have told you that. He had come down from his office on the 4th floor 40 minutes ago, not because anything had called him here specifically, but because he had been sitting at his desk staring at a contract he couldn't bring himself to sign, and at some point, the walls of that office had started to feel less like walls and more like a question he didn't know how to answer. He came to the emergency department sometimes when that happened, not to intervene, not to check on staff, just to sit in the room where the work actually lived and remember what the work was for. He had been watching the room the way he always watched rooms, quietly, without drawing attention to the watching, when the sliding doors opened and the perfume came in. He noticed her the way you notice a change in weather. Not with alarm, not with judgment, just noted. A woman who moved like she expected clearance. He had seen the type before, in boardrooms and at fundraising dinners, and in the hallways of hospitals where money and medicine negotiated with each other in careful, practiced language. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. His eyes settled on the window, instead, on the rain still pressing hard against the glass, on the headlights of a cab, moving slowly through the street below, orange light blurring and stretching in the wet. $47 million. That was the number that had been sitting in his chest like something swallowed wrong for the past 3 weeks. The contract on his desk upstairs, the renewal agreement between Mercy General and the largest private insurance provider in Illinois, was worth $47 million to the hospital's annual operating budget. 30% of what kept the lights on the staff paid the equipment maintained. The board had been clear this contract was not optional. This contract was the difference between a hospital that could serve this community and one that had to start making choices about which parts of the community it could afford to serve. He knew all of that. He had known it when he sat down with the contract 3 weeks ago, and he had known it every day since when he picked up the pen and put it down again, without signing. He was still thinking about the pen when Diane Hargrove completed her slow circuit of the room and stopped near the row of chairs where a woman in navy scrubs sat with a small child asleep against her shoulder. Something in Diane's movement changed. The deliberate pace, the inventory taking, it paused. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes moved from the woman's worn sneakers to the scrubs, to the child, to the piece of paper folded in the front pocket of the woman's bag, the edge of it just visible above the zipper. She didn't move closer. She didn't look away either. Her eyes stayed on Rebecca Calloway, and something behind them settled into a particular kind of attention, the attention of a person who has found something to think about. The perfume arrived first. It moved through the waiting room ahead of her, the way an announcement moves through a crowd. Not loud, not asking permission, simply present in a way that made the air around it feel different. It was the kind of fragrance that didn't come from a department store counter, the kind that came from a small bottle with no price tag visible, because the price was never the point. The point was that you knew. You always knew. Then came the coat, camel-colored, draped over her shoulders rather than worn because wearing a coat implied you had needed it. A bag on her left arm, dark cognac leather, structured with hardware that caught the waiting room's fluorescent light and threw it back like a small, quiet argument. The diamond on her left hand did the same thing every time her fingers moved. Diane Hargrove was 43 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning not in any classroom, but in the particular school of rooms that rearrange themselves around certain people, that the way you enter a space determines everything that happens inside it. She had mastered the entrance the way some people master a language, fluently, automatically, without thinking about it anymore. She paused just inside the sliding doors, not because she was uncertain, because she was taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the waiting room, the way a hotel guest's eyes move across a room that is not up to standard noting, cataloging, deciding. The plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows. The vending machine with a handwritten out-of-order sign taped over the coffee option. The television mounted high on the wall, cycling through a local news segment, with the volume set too low to follow. The people in the chairs, a man with something wrapped around his wrist, an older woman with her head bent, a teenager who looked like he hadn't slept since Thursday. And the smell of the place, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that no amount of cleaning product had ever fully covered. The particular smell of a building where people came when they had run out of other options. Diane's assistant, a young woman in her mid-20s, who had been hired 6 months ago and had already learned that her primary job function was anticipatory agreement, moved to the check-in desk without being asked. Diane herself did not move toward the desk. She moved toward the seating area, slowly, in the way of a woman who understood that moving slowly in a room where everyone else was waiting was its own kind of statement. She chose a path along the far wall. In the far corner of the waiting room, in the chair closest to the hallway that led back toward the treatment area, a man sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped being young a long time ago, but had found something better on the other side of it. Settled, attentive, the face of someone who had spent decades listening to things that mattered and had learned to be quiet about what he heard. His jacket was good, but not new. His tie was loosened at the collar, the knot pulled an inch down from where it had started the day. A paper coffee cup sat on the floor beside his right shoe, long since empty. This was Jonathan Marsh, the chief of medicine at Mercy General, though nothing about the way he was sitting would have told you that. He had come down from his office on the 4th floor 40 minutes ago, not because anything had called him here specifically, but because he had been sitting at his desk, staring at a contract he couldn't bring himself to sign, and at some point, the walls of that office had started to feel less like walls and more like a question he didn't know how to answer. He came to the emergency department, sometimes when that happened, not to intervene, not to check on staff, just to sit in the room where the work actually lived and remember what the work was for. He had been watching the room the way he always watched rooms, quietly, without drawing attention to the watching. When the sliding doors opened and the perfume came in, he noticed her the way you notice a change in weather. Not with alarm, not with judgment, just noted, a woman who moved like she expected clearance. He had seen the type before in boardrooms and at fundraising dinners and in the hallways of hospitals, where money and medicine negotiated with each other in careful, practiced language. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. His eyes settled onto a window, instead, on the rain still pressing hard against the glass, on the headlights of a cab moving slowly through the street below, orange light, blurring and stretching in the wet. $47 million. That was the number that had been sitting in his chest like something swallowed wrong for the past 3 weeks. The contract on his desk upstairs, the renewal agreement between Mercy General and the largest private insurance provider in Illinois, was worth $47 million to the hospital's annual operating budget. 30% of what kept the lights on, the staff, paid the equipment maintained. The board had been clear, this contract was not optional. This contract was the difference between a hospital that could serve this community and one that had to start making choices about which parts of the community it could afford to serve. He knew all of that. He had known it when he sat down with the contract 3 weeks ago, and he had known it every day since when he picked up the pen and put it down again, without signing. He was still thinking about the pen when Diane Hargrove completed her slow circuit of the room and stopped near the row of chairs where a woman in navy scrubs sat with a small child asleep against her shoulder. Something in Diane's movement changed. The deliberate pace, the inventory taking it paused. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes moved from the woman's worn sneakers to the scrubs, to the child, to the piece of paper folded in the front pocket of the woman's bag, the edge of it just visible above the zipper. She didn't move closer. She didn't look away either. Her eyes stayed on Rebecca Calloway, and something behind them, settled into a particular kind of attention, the attention of a person who has found something to think about. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. The words came out at a conversational volume, the kind of volume that assumes everyone within range is already listening, because in Diane Hargrove's experience, they usually were. She had stepped closer to the check-in area, close enough to the row where Rebecca sat, that the distance between them was no longer something that could be called accidental. She looked at the card in Rebecca's hand, the pale blue Medicaid card that Rebecca had just pulled from her wallet in preparation for the desk, and she looked at it the way a person looks at something that confirms what they already suspected. Then she spoke, not to Rebecca, to the woman behind the check-in desk, but in the particular way that means the words are for the whole room. I just want to make sure there's a separate process for, she paused, and the pause did more work than any word could have, for different types of coverage. Some of us have been waiting, and I'd hate for there to be any confusion about priority. It landed the way those kinds of sentences always land. Not like a shout, like a door closing in someone's face, while they're still mid-sentence. The words themselves were almost reasonable, almost administrative. If you read them on paper, you might have convinced yourself they were a genuine logistical concern. But no one in that waiting room read them on paper. They heard them in the air, with the pause, with the look, with the 43 years of practice delivery behind them. The woman behind the check-in desk, her name tag read Carla, and she had been working this desk for 11 years and had heard every possible version of every possible thing a person could say in a waiting room looked down at her keyboard. Not because she had something to type, because she had learned in 11 years that there were certain moments where looking down was the only available option. The man with the wrapped wrist found something very interesting to study on the floor between his shoes. The older woman with the rosary didn't look up, but her lips stopped moving. 2 seats away from Rebecca, a woman in her 30s with a toddler on her lap shifted the child to her other knee and turned slightly, angling her body toward the wall in the small, practiced movement of someone removing themselves from a situation without technically leaving it. The waiting room didn't go silent. It went careful. There is a difference. Silence is the absence of sound. Careful is the presence of people who are paying close attention and have decided each for their own reason that paying attention is as far as they are willing to go. In the corner chair, near the hallway, Jonathan Marsh had gone still. Not the relaxed stillness of a moment ago when he had been watching the rain and thinking about contracts and coffee. This was a different kind of still. The stillness of a person who has just heard something and is deciding what to do with what they heard. He did not move on. He did not look away from the middle distance he had been studying. But something in the set of his shoulders changed the way a room changes when someone turns off a fan you didn't realize was running. Near the vending machine, in the chair closest to the wall, a man who had appeared to be asleep for the better part of the last 20 minutes shifted almost imperceptibly. His chin was still dropped toward his chest. His eyes were still closed, or close enough to closed, that no one would have looked twice. But his right hand, which had been resting loose and open on his thigh, moved, just slightly. The fingers curled, traveled a short distance toward the breast pocket of his jacket, and rested there, still, waiting. Nobody noticed. Rebecca noticed everything and said nothing. She had been a night shift nurse for 8 years, which meant she had spent 8 years in rooms where people were at their most frightened, their most desperate, their most unguarded, and she had learned in those 8 years that the way a person responds to being looked at, the way Diane had just looked at her, was a choice, not a reflex. A choice, and she had made hers a long time ago. She did not look up. She did not pull the Medicaid card back into her wallet. She held it in the same hand at the same angle and waited for the check-in desk to call her name, with the same expression she had walked in, with the steady, even expression of a woman who had decided that other people's assessments of where she belonged were not information she needed to carry. The check-in desk called her name. Rebecca stood. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. She stepped up to the desk and placed the card on the counter with the same quiet, unhurried movement she used for everything. The movement of someone who understood that rushing was a form of apology, and she had nothing to apologize for. Diane watched her. Across the room, Jonathan watched Diane watching her. The fluorescent lights kept humming. The rain kept hitting the glass. The television on the wall cycled to a weather segment, and a meteorologist gestured at a map of a storm system moving across Lake Michigan with the cheerful detachment of someone whose job required them to find all weather equally interesting. Rebecca finished at the desk and turned back toward the seating area. She settled into her chair. She reached into her bag for the folded letter, then stopped and left it where it was. She put her bag on the floor beside her feet instead, looped the strap around her ankle, the way you do when you've learned not to leave things unattended, and leaned back against the wall. Diane had not moved far. She was standing near the end of the row, still holding her bag against her arm, still wearing the coat over her shoulders. She was looking at her phone now, or appearing to the particular way of looking at a phone. That means you are not reading anything, just waiting for the next thing to say. The room settled back into its careful quiet. And then, against Rebecca's left arm, something shifted. A small hand pressed flat against the fabric of her scrubs. A small body uncurled from the position it had been holding for the last 40 minutes. Lily turned her face away from her mother's shoulder, blinking against the light, the slow, confused blink of a child waking somewhere unfamiliar, trying to remember how she got there. Her dark eyes moved around the room. The chairs, the desk, the television, the woman in the coat standing near the end of the row. Lily was 5 years old. She didn't have words for what she felt. In that moment, the particular shift in the air that had pulled her up out of sleep. But she felt it the way children feel things, before they can name them, the way you feel a change in pressure, before you hear the thunder. She looked up at her mother. Lily's eyes found her mother's face, the way they always did when she woke somewhere unfamiliar, immediately, without searching the way a compass needle finds north. And Rebecca looked back at her daughter the way she always did, in those first seconds of waking, with the particular steadiness of a woman who understood that the first thing a child sees when she opens her eyes sets the temperature of everything that follows. She brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. Lily blinked, looked around the room once, slowly, then leaned back into her mother's side, without a word, satisfied by whatever she had found in Rebecca's expression. Rebecca kept her hand on her daughter's hair. And something in the smallness of that moment, the weight of Lily's head, the warmth of her, the way her breathing was still slow and even, despite everything, pulled Rebecca somewhere she hadn't meant to go. 2 years ago, November, the same hospital 2 floors down. It had been a Tuesday night, which mattered only because Tuesday nights were historically quiet, and Rebecca had just started thinking about the last hour of her shift when the call came through. Treatment Room 7, pediatric emergency. 8-year-old male, brought in by private car, unresponsive, on arrival. She had covered the distance from the nurse's station to Treatment Room 7 in the kind of focused, unhurried speed that looks calm from the outside and is anything but. The boy was small for his age, slight, with dark hair, and the kind of stillness that is not sleep and not peace, but the absence of both. His name, according to the woman who had carried him in from the car, was Ethan. The woman was his mother. She was wearing a dinner dress, deep emerald green, the kind worn to the sort of event where you don't check your phone during the main course. Her hair was still pinned up. One earring was missing, lost somewhere between the restaurant and the car and the hospital entrance. She was holding Ethan's jacket in both arms, pressed against her chest, and she was not crying yet. She was in the place that comes before crying, the place where the body hasn't fully understood what the mind already knows. Rebecca had seen that look before. She knew what it meant, and she knew what it required, which was not comfort. Yet comfort came later, but action precise and immediate, and without the luxury of hesitation. The next 4 minutes were the kind that don't move in a straight line. They compress and expand in ways that make no sense when you try to describe them afterward, but make complete sense when you're inside them. Rebecca worked. The team worked. The monitors said what they said, and the hands did what hands do when they have been trained for exactly this and nothing else. Nothing. At some point during those 4 minutes, the boy's mother had stepped back from the doorway. Rebecca hadn't seen her go. There was no margin for watching anything except the work directly in front of her. She had registered the green dress at the edge of her vision, and then the green dress was gone, and there was only Ethan and the equipment and the particular held-breath quality of a room where every person present understands that the next few seconds are not negotiable. The monitors changed. The room exhaled. Rebecca stayed with Ethan for the next 2 hours. Not because her shift required it. Technically, she was already past the point where she could have handed off and gone home. She stayed because he woke up confused and frightened in a room full of strangers, and because the woman in the green dress had not come back, and because Rebecca had learned a long time ago that the hardest part of a night like that for a child was not the crisis itself, but the moment after, when everything was supposed to be fine, and the child couldn't understand why the room still felt wrong. She sat beside his bed and talked to him about nothing important about the Cubs, about whether the vending machine on the second floor had the good kind of chips or the disappointing kind, about a story she half remembered from when she was about his age. He fell back asleep around 2 a.m. She waited until his breathing had settled into something deep, and even then, checked his chart one more time, spoke briefly with the overnight attending, and went back to finish what remained of her shift. She never saw his mother again that night. She learned later from the day shift nurse, who mentioned it in passing, that the boy's mother had been in the family waiting area down the hall, that she had stepped out to make a phone call when things had been most uncertain, and that by the time she came back, her son was stable, and the immediate crisis had passed. She had apparently asked who had been with him. She had been told the night shift team. She had nodded, asked about discharge paperwork, and that was the end of it. The day shift nurse had said it the way people say things that aren't quite remarkable enough to be a real story, but are just strange enough to stick. Rebecca had filed it somewhere in the back of her mind and gone home to sleep. She had not thought about it much after that. There was always another shift, always another room, always another small body that needed someone to stay. The waiting room came back around her slowly, the way rooms do after a memory. The fluorescent lights reasserting themselves, the hum of the building, the sound of rain still working against the windows with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. Lily had fallen back asleep. Her weight was warm, and even against Rebecca's side, her breathing settled again into that deep, unconscious rhythm. Rebecca lifted her eyes from her daughter's face. Across the waiting room, Diane Hargrove was standing with her phone in her hand, her coat still draped over her shoulders, her bag still on her arm. She was speaking to her assistant in a low voice. Something about a reservation, something about a car. She touched the diamond on her left hand, once, absently, the way people touch familiar things when they are thinking about something else. She did not look in Rebecca's direction. Rebecca looked at her. Rebecca looked away from Diane. She looked down instead at Lily, at the slow rise and fall of her daughter's small chest, at the way Lily's fingers had found the hem of her scrub top in sleep, and were holding it loosely, the way she always held things she wanted to keep close, without knowing she was doing it. There was a woman Rebecca had been thinking about for most of her adult life. Not constantly, not painfully, just the way you think about the person who shaped the most important decision you ever made. Her name was Carol. She had Rebecca's hands, Rebecca's jawline the same way of tilting her head slightly to the left when something struck her as genuinely funny. She had spent the last 11 days of her life in a hospital room in Camden, New Jersey, and Rebecca had been 14 years old for every one of those 11 days. Camden's public hospital was understaffed in the way that institutions are understaffed when the people who control the funding live far enough from the consequences that the consequences feel theoretical. There were good people there. Rebecca had understood that even at 14, but good people, working impossible hours, in under-resourced rooms, could only be in one place at a time, and her mother's room was not always that place. She remembered calling one evening from the payphone in the visitor's lobby. She wasn't old enough to stay past visiting hours, and her mother's voice on the other end, sounding smaller than it had any right to sound. Carol told her she had pressed the call button twice that afternoon and waited a long time before anyone came. She hadn't said it as a complaint. She said it the way she said most hard things, matter-of-factly, with a determined lightness, as though minimizing the weight of something could change how much it actually weighed. Rebecca had not been in the room when her mother passed. She had been in school because Carol had made her promise, had actually made her promise on one of the last visits to go to school and not sit in waiting rooms. So Rebecca had kept her promise, and her mother had been alone. And by the time the call came, it was already over. She was 14 years old, standing in a school hallway with a phone pressed to her ear, and she had understood two things at the same time. First, that there was nothing to be done about what had already happened, and second, that the moments before the end mattered more than anyone seemed to account for, that the presence of another person, a hand, a voice, the simple act of staying was not a small thing. In certain rooms at certain hours, it was the only thing. She had decided that afternoon that she was going to be the person who stayed, not to fix the unfixable, not to perform hope where there wasn't any, just to be present in the rooms where presence was what mattered most. It had taken 4 years of working nights at a diner and taking every scholarship she could find to get there. But she had gotten there. 8 years of night shifts, 8 years of being in the room at 2 and 3 in the morning, when the building was quiet and the work was at its least visible and most necessary. Nobody made speeches about the 2 a.m. shift. It happened in the dark, and most of the time, the people on the receiving end didn't fully remember what had been done for them. Only that at some point, they had been frightened, and then somehow less so. That had always been enough. Lily shifted against her side. Rebecca adjusted her arm without thinking, and Lily settled again. Across the waiting room, Jonathan Marsh had not moved from his corner chair. His paper coffee cup sat empty on the floor beside his shoe. He was looking toward the window, though the rain and the darkness had turned the glass, mostly, into a mirror, giving back a dim reflection of the room, rather than any view of the street below. He was thinking about his mother. Eleanor Marsh was 68 years old and lived in the same Hyde Park house where Jonathan had grown up. She was not a woman who called her son at the hospital unless something required it. She had called him 8 months ago on a Wednesday afternoon, and her voice had been the kind of careful that meant she had been rehearsing what she was going to say. She had received a letter from her insurance provider. Jonathan knew the letter before she finished reading it to him. He had seen versions of it before. The same structure, the same carefully neutral language, the same plain white envelope, the same essential message delivered in the most bloodless way possible. The procedure his mother needed did not meet their current criteria for coverage. Her doctor had used words like progressive and window of time. The insurance company had said no. Jonathan had covered the cost himself and told his mother it was handled, and he had gone back to work the following Monday and said nothing to anyone in that building, because telling people wasn't the point. Taking care of his mother was the point. But he had not forgotten. He had not forgotten the weight of that phone call, or the way his mother's voice had sounded, still careful, still trying to protect him from something she thought was hers to carry alone. He had not forgotten the name printed at the top of that letter, in clean navy letters, above a tagline about comprehensive care and trusted coverage. He was sitting with that memory, not for any reason he could have named, just the way certain things come back when you're tired and the room is quiet, when his phone moved against his thigh. He looked at the screen without picking it up. A name, a number. The phone kept going. He watched it the way you watch something you've already decided about, waiting for it to stop. Then he pressed the side button once. The room went quiet again. The phone call that went unanswered didn't change anything about the room. The waiting area kept humming. The rain kept working. The television cycled to a commercial for a mattress that promised better sleep, and somewhere near the entrance, a child who had been fussing quietly for the past 20 minutes finally stopped. What changed was Diane. She had been standing near the end of the row, with her phone in her hand, speaking to her assistant in the low, clipped tones of someone accustomed to having instructions carried out without repetition. But at some point, and no one in the room could have said exactly when, she had stopped talking to her assistant and started looking at the chairs, specifically at the row where Rebecca sat, specifically at the 2 empty seats on Rebecca's right, one of which held Rebecca's bag, and the other of which held Lily's small jacket, folded into a rough square that served as a kind of armrest for the sleeping child. Diane crossed the room. She stopped in front of Rebecca with the particular stillness of a woman who had never in her adult life needed to ask for something twice and was already preemptively annoyed at the possibility that she might need to now. "Excuse me," she said it the way a person says, "excuse me," when they don't mean it as a question. "I need that seat." Rebecca looked up. Her expression did not change, not tighter, not looser, the same level steadiness she had been wearing since she walked in. She looked at Diane the way she looked at a monitor, reading, gathering information, not yet responding to it. She said, "My daughter is sleeping." "I can see that." Diane's chin lifted slightly. "There are other arrangements that can be made. I've been standing for quite a while, and I have a condition that—" "There are seats along the far wall," Rebecca said, not unkindly, not as a challenge. The way a person states a fact that doesn't require elaboration. Something shifted in Diane's expression. Not dramatically. She was too practiced for drama, but in the small, specific way of a person who has issued a request and received a response that was not the one they expected and has not yet decided how to process that. She was accustomed to a particular sequence of events she asked people rearranged. The sequence had just failed to initiate, and the pause that followed had a texture to it, not quite silence, not quite confrontation, but the space between two people where one of them is deciding how much further to take something. The man with the wrapped wrist had stopped studying the floor. He was looking at his phone now, with the fixed concentration of someone who is not reading anything, but needs somewhere to put his eyes. Carla, at the check-in desk, had found something in her computer that required her complete attention. The woman with the toddler had turned her child around on her lap, so he was facing away from the exchange. The automatic redirect of a parent who has learned to manage a child's attention in a crowded room. Near the vending machine, the man who had appeared to be sleeping had not moved. His chin was still dropped. His right hand was still resting near his jacket pocket, the way it had been for the past several minutes. Still, patient, Jonathan Marsh put both hands on his knees. It was the kind of movement that means something, the specific positioning of a person who is about to stand up. His weight shifted forward. His shoulders came up slightly. In another second, he would have been on his feet. He sat back, not because he had decided not to, because he hadn't finished deciding, because the situation in front of him was not yet at the point where he could name clearly and specifically what he was standing up to do. And he had learned in 30 years of medicine that acting before you could name the thing you were acting against was how you made things worse instead of better. So he sat back. He put his hands on his knees again, this time, with more deliberateness, the way you put something down when you want to remember exactly where you left it. Diane had not moved from in front of Rebecca. She had simply waited out the pause, let it stretch to the point where it became its own kind of pressure. And then, when Rebecca did not feel it, she had recalibrated. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable," she said. The delivery had changed, softer now on the surface, the kind of soft that is a tool rather than a feeling. "I'm simply pointing out that in a waiting room, there's a basic expectation of—" "She's been here for 2 hours," Rebecca said. Still the same tone, the same level register, the kind that does not rise to meet provocation, because it hasn't decided that provocation is what's being offered. "She's 5 years old, and she's not well, and she's sleeping. I'm not going to move her." 5 words of that sentence landed differently than the others. She's 5 years old. Not said for sympathy, said as information. The kind of information you offer when you want to make sure all the relevant facts are in the room. Diane heard them. Her eyes moved just briefly, just a fraction from Rebecca's face, downward, to the small body leaning against Rebecca's side, to the yellow duck on the front of the sweatshirt, to the shoes on the wrong feet, to the way Lily's hand still held the hem of her mother's scrubs, even in sleep, holding on without knowing she was doing it. Diane looked at Lily, and something in the quality of her attention changed, sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with the chair anymore. She didn't speak, not yet. There are silences, and then there are silences. The waiting room had been quiet, in the careful way it had been quiet for the past 20 minutes. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of tension, but the management of it. People keeping their eyes and their voices and their reactions contained within the borders of their own space, because that is what you do in a room full of strangers when something uncomfortable is happening, and leaving is not an option. What fell over the room now was different. It came after Diane spoke. And what Diane said, she said clearly, not loudly, not in the register of a person making a scene, but in the flat, even almost administrative tone of someone delivering an observation they consider self-evident. She was still looking at Lily. She said it to the room the way you say something to the room, when you want everyone to hear it, but don't want to be accused of saying it to anyone specifically. Some people, she said, really ought to think more carefully about the situations they bring children into. It's not fair to the child growing up like this, learning that the world just accommodates. 9 words landed differently than the rest. Growing up like this, said the way a person says something they have been sharpening quietly for several minutes, waiting for the right angle of delivery. Not a shout, not a whisper. The measured, unhurried cruelty of someone who has never once been asked to account for the things she says to people she has already decided don't count. The waiting room did not go quiet. It went still. There is a difference. Quiet is something that happens to sound. Still is something that happens to people, the full body cessation of movement that occurs when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone in earshot is processing the fact of it. Carla, at the check-in desk, stopped typing. Her fingers rested on the keyboard and did not move. The man with the wrapped wrist, who had been scrolling through his phone with the determined focus of someone trying very hard to be elsewhere, lowered the phone to his lap. He did not look up, but he stopped scrolling. The teenager near the vending machine, who had finally let his head fall back against the wall and closed his eyes, opened them. He looked at Diane. Then he looked at his sneakers. Then he looked at the wall, and his jaw tightened once, and he said nothing. The woman with the toddler pulled her child closer against her chest, not because the child needed it, but because she did. Near the jacket pocket, the still hand stayed still. Rebecca did not turn around. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the letter in her bag, or the words that were almost certainly moving through her in that moment, because there were words anyone watching her hands would have known that the way they had gone from resting loosely on her knees to pressing flat against them, the way the line of her shoulders had changed by a single specific degree, the way she exhaled once through her nose, with the controlled deliberateness of a woman who has learned at considerable cost the discipline of deciding which battles she fights and which ones she refuses to let be battles at all. She did not turn around, but she pulled Lily closer. It was a small movement, one arm tightening slightly around the child's shoulders, drawing her in by an inch, maybe 2. Lily stirred, but did not wake. She made a small sound and turned her face further into her mother's side, and Rebecca's hand came up and rested on her daughter's back and stayed there. That was all. That was everything. The room understood what it had just witnessed. Not a confrontation. Rebecca had not given Diane the confrontation. Not a surrender. Rebecca had not moved from her chair, had not looked at Diane, had not changed anything about her posture, except to make herself a slightly more complete shelter for the child against her side. What the room had witnessed was something quieter and more absolute than either of those things. The particular dignity of a woman who has decided that some things in the world are worth protecting, and that the best way to protect them is not to expose them to the thing that wants to diminish them. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Somewhere in the treatment area, beyond the double doors, a phone rang twice and stopped. Diane had not moved. She was still standing at the end of the row, still holding her bag, still wearing the coat over her shoulders. She had the expression of a person who has thrown something into a room, expecting a reaction, and received instead a closed door. She opened her mouth. Whether she had something more to say, or whether she was simply not finished, was a question the room never got to answer. Because in the far corner in the chair closest to the hallway, something changed. The sound of it was small, the specific sound of a paper cup being set on the floor with more care than was strictly necessary. Then, the sound of a jacket shifting. Then the sound of weight transferring from a seat to 2 feet deliberately, without hurry. Jonathan Marsh stood up. He did not look at Diane as he stepped away from the chair. He did not look at Rebecca. He looked straight ahead at the middle distance between where he had been sitting and where he was going, and he moved through the waiting room, the way a person moves when they have finished being the kind of person who watches and have decided, without announcement or ceremony, to be a different kind instead. He stepped out of the corner. He stepped into the light. The first thing Diane noticed was that he was not what she expected. She had heard the movement from the corner, the deliberate sound of someone standing up with intention, and she had turned with the automatic readiness of a woman who had spent decades managing rooms, which meant managing the people in them, which meant assessing threats and opportunities in the same half-second glance. She had turned, expecting to find a hospital administrator, a security guard, someone in a uniform with a practice script for situations like this. What she found was a man in a loosened tie and a jacket that had seen better decades, carrying nothing, wearing nothing that would tell you anything about who he was. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had arrived at stillness through long practice, rather than indifference, the face of a person who had spent a great deal of time in rooms where things happened that mattered and had learned to be very quiet about all of it. He stopped a few feet from her, not close enough to crowd, close enough that she would have had to work to pretend he wasn't there. He looked at her. He did not speak immediately. He let the space between them hold for a moment, not awkwardly, not as a performance of patience, simply the pause of a person who has decided exactly what he is going to say and sees no reason to rush the saying of it. When he spoke, his voice was level, the kind of level that doesn't come from calm, but from a long history of choosing calm over the alternative. You said that a child should be careful not to grow up like her mother. He did not phrase it as a question. He did not add anything to it. No commentary, no editorial, no indication of how he felt about it. He simply said it back. The same words arranged the same way, returned to the room at the same conversational volume at which they had been delivered, as though he were reading from a transcript, as though he wanted to make sure the record was accurate. The sentence landed differently the second time. The first time, it had come, wrapped in Diane's particular delivery, the practiced neutrality, the almost reasonable framing, the way she had addressed it to the room, rather than to any specific person. Stripped of all that now returned, in a stranger's voice, with no wrapper at all, it sat in the air of the waiting room, and was exactly what it was. Carla, at the check-in desk, looked up for the first time in several minutes. The teenager near the vending machine had stopped looking at his sneakers. The woman with the toddler had gone very still. Diane's expression did not change. She had a face that was very good at not changing a skill developed over decades of social situations that required the appearance of composure regardless of what was happening underneath it. She looked at the man in front of her with the specific attention of someone reevaluating a situation they thought they had already fully understood. She took in the jacket, the loosened tie, the absence of anything on his wrist, any logo on his chest, any marker of the kind of position she used to calibrate her responses to people. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that functions as a dismissal, the particular expression a person produces when they have categorized someone and found the category unimpressive and want that assessment to be visible without having to say it out loud. "And who are you?" she said. She said it the way a person says, "And who are you?" when the question is not really a question, when it is a way of saying, "You are not someone whose opinion I need to account for, and I would like you to know that I know that, so that we can both stop pretending this conversation is happening between equals." The man did not answer. He did not seem bothered by the question, or by the smile, or by the specific weight she had loaded into 4 words. He simply stood where he was, with his hands at his sides, and his expression unchanged, and let her question settle into the room without picking it up. Then he turned his head. Not toward the exit, not toward the check-in desk. He turned toward the row of chairs where Rebecca was sitting, and he looked not at Rebecca's face, not at Lily, not at anything that would have told the room he was making a point. He looked at the badge clipped to the left side of Rebecca's scrub top, a small white rectangle, hospital issue, the kind worn on every floor of every shift, so routine that most people in the building stop seeing them the way you stop seeing furniture in a room you know well. He looked at it. The letters were small, but clear from where he stood. R. Calloway, night shift, ICU. He read it once. Then, he was still the particular stillness of a man in whom something has just arrived, something that has not yet made its way from the place where things are received to the place where they are understood, and who has the presence of mind not to move or speak until that journey is complete. The waiting room held its breath. Memory does not always arrive in order. Sometimes it comes the way a word comes, when you've been trying to remember it for hours, and then suddenly it's there, not because you found it, but because something in the room shifted just enough to let it through. A face, a name, a small white rectangle clipped to the left side of a scrub top in a waiting room at midnight. Jonathan had not moved. He was still standing in the same position, still looking at the badge, and the waiting room was still holding whatever it had been holding since he'd stood up from that corner chair. But inside him, something was moving, the specific interior motion of a mind, pulling up a file it had not accessed in a long time, brushing off what had accumulated on top of it, and beginning carefully to read. R. Calloway, night shift, ICU. He had heard that name before, not from a meeting, not from a performance review or a staffing report, or any of the 100 administrative channels through which names passed through his office and out the other side without fully landing. He had heard it the way you hear things that matter from a person in a kitchen over a cup of tea that had gone cold because neither of them had thought to drink it. His mother had told him about a nurse. She had told him the way she told things that had genuinely moved her, which was carefully and with the particular precision of someone who wanted to make sure the person listening understood exactly what had happened and did not allow the telling to become less than the thing itself. She had said there was a nurse on the night shift who had stayed, not because the chart required it, not because the floor was short-staffed and there was nowhere else to be. She had stayed because Eleanor Marsh was frightened and alone, and the nurse had looked at her and understood that and had made a decision accordingly. She had said the nurse's name. Jonathan had written it down on the inside cover of the notebook he kept on his desk at home, the one where he kept the things that mattered enough to keep but didn't belong in any official record. He had written it down and told himself he would do something with it. Send a letter, make a call, find some way to put into the official record the fact that someone had done something genuinely good in a room where no one was watching. He had not done it. The weeks had moved the way weeks move when a hospital system does not wait for you to finish grieving before it presents the next thing that requires your attention. The notebook was still on his desk. The name was still in it. R. Calloway. He looked up from the badge. He looked at her face, at Rebecca's profile, turned slightly away from him, her attention fixed on Lily, one hand still resting on her daughter's back. He looked at the set of her shoulders and the steadiness in them, in the way she had sat in that chair for the past hour, and absorbed everything that had been directed at her, without once changing the fundamental thing about her, which was that she was a woman who had decided a long time ago who she was, and had not found anything in this room persuasive enough to revise that decision. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to Diane. Diane had been watching him with the expression of a person waiting for a punchline that is taking longer than expected. The smile was still in place technically, but it had lost some of its structural integrity, the corners of it no longer quite doing the work they had been assigned. Jonathan said, "I want to ask you something." His voice was still level, still unhurried, the voice of a man who understood that volume was a tool for people who needed to compensate for something, and that he did not. 2 years ago, he said, you brought a child into this emergency department, late at night. He was 8 years old, and he was not doing well. He paused, not for effect, but the way you pause when you're being precise, and precision requires it. There was a nurse on duty that night who stayed with him, past the end of her shift. For 2 hours, while the situation was still uncertain, she sat beside him. She talked to him. She did not leave until she was certain he was stable and that he knew he was not alone. The waiting room had gone very quiet. The particular quiet of people who have stopped pretending to do anything other than listen. That nurse, Jonathan said, is the woman you have been speaking to tonight. He did not gesture toward Rebecca. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Diane, and he let the sentence stand in the room exactly as it was, not dressed up, not editorialized, just the plain and unadorned fact of it, placed in the space between them for Diane to pick up and turn over and understand in whatever way she was capable of understanding it. The smile left Diane's face, not gradually, the way a light goes out when the power cuts there, and then not there, and the room somehow darker than it was a moment before, even though the actual lighting hasn't changed. She looked at Rebecca, really looked for the first time, not the inventory-taking assessment of before, not the categorizing glance, but the specific and effortful focus of a person trying to match a face to a fact that has just rearranged everything she thought she knew about the last 20 minutes. She looked for a long time, long enough that it became its own kind of answer. She did not recognize her. She looked, and the recognition did not come, and that absence was somehow louder than anything that had been said in this room all night. The specific silence of a woman understanding that she had looked at the person in front of her so many times tonight without once actually seeing her, and that nothing about the looking was going to change what had just been said about what had been done. Diane opened her mouth. The room waited. Nothing came out. Diane still had not spoken. The room was still waiting for whatever was going to come next, suspended in the particular way of rooms where something significant has just happened and no one is quite sure who has the authority to declare what comes after it. Diane's mouth had closed again. Her hand had found the strap of her bag, and her fingers were working it slowly. Not a gesture she would have made deliberately. The involuntary movement of a person whose composure is drawing on reserves it hadn't expected to need tonight. Jonathan was no longer looking at her. His eyes had moved not to Rebecca's face, not to Lily, not to the room at large. They had moved downward to the front pocket of the bag, at Rebecca's feet, where the edge of a folded piece of paper was visible above the zipper. He had noticed it before peripherally, the way you notice things in a room without registering them fully. He registered it now. He took a step toward Rebecca, not close enough to close the distance between the middle of the room and the row of chairs by half. He stopped there and looked at the paper. Something about it was familiar, in the way that certain things are familiar, before you can say why. The size of it, the weight of the fold, the particular way the crease had gone soft from repeated handling. He had seen paper held that way before, on his kitchen table, in his mother's hands. "May I?" he said. Rebecca looked at him. The question, 2 words, no context, hung between them for a moment while she assessed it and him with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that offers from strangers came in a wide range of shapes, and that the shape of the offer was not always the same as its content. Then she reached into the pocket and held the letter out. He took it with both hands. He unfolded it along the existing crease, the paper opening with the soft resistance of something that had been folded and unfolded many times. He read it the way he read things that mattered, starting at the top, moving down the page without skipping, giving each line the time it required. The letterhead first, clean design, professional, the kind of correspondence that had been carefully engineered to look like communication while functioning as its opposite. The logo in the upper left corner. Jonathan went still, not the thoughtful stillness of a moment ago when he had been working something out. This was a different quality of stillness entirely, the stillness of a person who has just understood something and needs a moment before they can continue to be a person who moves and speaks and operates normally in the world. The name above the tagline itself, comprehensive, care, trusted coverage in the smaller font below it. He had read those words before, on a different letter, in a different room 8 months ago, while his mother's voice came through the phone, careful and practiced, and trying very hard to protect him from something she thought was hers to manage alone. He read the body of the letter. After careful review of the submitted documentation, we regret to inform you that the requested procedure does not meet the criteria for medical necessity as defined under your current plan. The procedure. He read the line that named it. He read it once, then read it again, the way you reread something when the first reading produced a result your mind wants to verify before accepting. Lily's heart surgery. He looked up from the paper. Not at Diane. He didn't look at Diane. He looked at Lily, at the small body still leaning against her mother's side, still holding the hem of the scrub top in sleep, still breathing in the slow and trusting rhythm of a child who does not yet know what the adults in her life are carrying on her behalf. 5 years old. He thought about the word his mother's doctor had used. Window. He thought about what windows did when you didn't use them, how they didn't stay open, how the specific kind of window a doctor meant when they used that word was not the kind that could be reopened once it had closed. He thought about the nurse who had sat beside his mother at 2 a.m. and said, "I'm right here," and meant it. He thought about the 8 months between that night and this one, and what had happened in those 8 months to the woman who had said those words. And he thought about the letter in his hands, and the logo at the top of it, and the name of the company that had printed it. The same name, the same logo, the same careful, neutral, bloodless language deployed in the service of the same essential decision that the thing this person needed did not meet their criteria and therefore would not be provided, and that this conclusion had been reached through a process that was by all available documentation entirely correct. He folded the letter carefully. Along the crease that was already there, the one worn soft by Rebecca's hands, over 3 days of unfolding and refolding, and trying to find a different way to read what it said. He looked at Rebecca. She was watching him with the stillness of a person who has extended a piece of trust and is waiting to see what the recipient does with it. He held the letter for one more moment. Then he turned, not toward Diane, not toward the check-in desk, toward the double doors that led to the treatment corridor and the bank of elevators beyond it, in the 4th-floor office where a contract sat on a desk with a pen beside it that had been picked up and set down more times than he could count. He walked to the doors, he pushed through them, and the waiting room for the first time all night did not know what came next. The corridor on the ground floor of Mercy General at midnight had a different quality than the rest of the building. It was not quieter, if anything. The emergency department corridor was the one part of the hospital that never fully settled, never reached the particular stillness of the upper floors, where the overnight patients slept, and the building seemed to briefly reconsider the pace it kept during the day. Down here, The lights stayed at full brightness around the clock, and the sounds were constant, and the air had the specific, compressed quality of a space that moved people through it continuously, without pause. Jonathan walked through it the way he had walked through it hundreds of times, with the directional certainty of someone who had spent enough years in this building that his feet knew the route before his mind had finished deciding to take it. Past the supply alcove, past the family consultation room, with its box of tissues on the table that was always replaced but always seemed to be running low, past the elevator bank where he stopped. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. While he waited, he took the letter from where he had folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest. He did not look at it again. He had read it twice, and that was enough. Some things you only need to read twice to carry for the rest of your life. The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed behind him, and the car rose in the particular silence of an elevator in a building at midnight, the kind of silence that exists between one decision and the next. The 4th floor was dark, except for the strip of light under his office door and the glow of the exit signs at each end of the hall. His assistant had gone home hours ago. The administrative wing had that specific after-hours quality. The computers in sleep mode, the chairs pushed in at careful angles, the surface of everything slightly more organized than it ever was during the day, as though the building tidied itself when the people left. He unlocked his office and sat down at his desk. The contract was exactly where he had left it. The pen was exactly where he had left it. $47 million, represented in 31 pages of language that his lawyers had reviewed and his board had approved, and every practical, operational, institutional part of him had understood for 3 weeks was the signature he needed to make. He picked up the pen. He held it the way he had held it every time he had sat down at this desk for the past 3 weeks, with the intention of using it and the inability to finish the thought. Then he set it down, not with frustration, not with ceremony. He set it down the way you set something down, when you have finally, after a long time of carrying it, understood that you are not going to pick it up again. He reached for the phone on his desk, the landline, not his cell, because some calls belong to an office rather than a pocket, and he dialed from memory. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, groggy with sleep, and adjusting quickly the way physicians adjust. Dr. Amara Osei was the head of pediatric cardiology at Mercy General, a careful and exacting woman who had, in Jonathan's experience, never once complained about being woken up for something that warranted it. "Amara," he said, "I need you to pull a file. Lily Calloway, 5 years old, existing patient. There's a procedure on hold, pending insurance approval." He paused. "I need it reclassified as a medical priority case and scheduled within the next 2 weeks. I'll explain the full situation in the morning, but I need you to initiate the paperwork tonight so it's in the system when the day shift starts." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then, "Understood. I'll take care of it." He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a moment with his hand still on the receiver. Then he dialed again. Marcus Webb had been the hospital's senior legal counsel for 9 years and had a particular gift for receiving late-night phone calls from Jonathan without sounding like he resented them. Jonathan appreciated this more than he had ever said out loud. "I need you to pull together the denied claims files for the past 18 months, Jonathan said when Marcus answered. "Any claim submitted to Hargrove Health Insurance that was rejected. I want a full accounting dates, patient identifiers, the stated reasons for denial, and the names of the reviewing physicians on record." He kept his voice even, the same register he used in the operating room, when the situation required precision, more than it required urgency. "All of it. I want it on my desk when I come in tomorrow." Marcus asked one question. Jonathan answered it in 2 sentences. Marcus said he would have it ready. Jonathan set the phone down. He looked at the contract. The clock on the wall above the door read 12 minutes past midnight. The deadline, the one the board had been clear about, the one his counterpart at the insurance group had called twice this week to confirm, the one that had been circled in red on the calendar. his assistant, kept on the shared server, had passed while he was sitting in a waiting room on the ground floor, listening to a woman who had never in her life been asked to account for anything she said to people she considered beneath her. $47 million. He thought about that number, the way he had been thinking about it, for 3 weeks. Not as an abstraction, not as a line item, but as what it actually was, what it paid for. The staff who showed up at 11 at night and stayed until 7 in the morning. The equipment in the rooms where the work happened that no one made speeches about. The overhead lights that hummed at full brightness at midnight, because the people who needed this building needed it to be there completely, without conditions attached. He thought about all of that. Then he thought about a letter to fold it inside his jacket, about a 5-year-old girl in a waiting room downstairs, asleep against her mother's side, with her shoes on the wrong feet, holding on in sleep to the fabric of the person who had decided a long time ago to be the kind of person who stayed. He opened the top drawer of his desk. He took out a different folder, not the contract, the other one, the one he had been building quietly for the past several months without telling anyone why. He set it on top of the contract. Then he stood. He straightened the folders into alignment on the desk. The habit of a man who had learned that leaving things in order was a form of respect for the version of yourself that would return to them in the morning. He pushed the chair in. He picked up his jacket from the back of it. He reached for the light switch by the door. The office went dark. The morning came, the way mornings come, after nights, that have taken something from you gray at the edges, arriving before you were finished with the dark. Jonathan had been at his desk since 7. The folders Marcus had promised were already there when he arrived, a stack of them, rubber-banded in pairs, each one representing a claim that had moved through the proper channels and arrived at the same destination. The word denied appeared on the top sheet 11 times before he stopped counting. He was on his second cup of coffee when his phone showed a new message from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was 4 words, "I was there last night." He opened it. The sender identified himself as Daniel Cho, a staff writer at the Chicago Tribune, currently working on an investigation into insurance claim denial patterns at several large private providers in Illinois. He had been at Mercy General's emergency waiting room the previous evening as part of his background research. He had not expected what he witnessed. He had recorded it audio, only the full exchange, from the moment the woman in the coat first spoke until the moment the door to the treatment corridor closed. He wrote that he had enough for a story, that the story was publishable on its own, that it would carry more weight, however, if it were connected to the pattern his investigation had been documenting for the past 4 months, if it had institutional record behind it, rather than a single incident in a waiting room. He wrote that he had looked up the hospital's board structure that morning. He wrote that he thought Jonathan might want to know the recording existed before deciding anything else. At the bottom, a phone number. No pressure. His words. Jonathan read it twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and looked at the stack of folders at the rubber bands at the tab, where Marcus had written the date range in his careful handwriting. Then he picked the phone back up and dialed. Daniel Cho was 31 years old, with the specific alertness of someone who had learned that the difference between a good story and an important one was not always the difference between what was interesting and what was true. He was waiting in the lobby when Jonathan came down, a compact man in a canvas jacket with a shoulder bag and the kind of shoes that said he spent most of his working life standing in places where things were happening. They found a corner where the morning foot traffic moved around them without requiring them to move. Jonathan said, "Tell me what you have," Daniel told him. 4 months of documentation, 18 months of claim data, 43 individual cases tracked through the appeals process, 31 of which had been upheld on denial after the first appeal. Physicians who had spoken to him off the record, a pattern that was not in his assessment, the result of individual reviewers making individual calls, but of a system deliberately calibrated to produce a specific outcome. And last night, Jonathan said, Daniel reached into his shoulder bag and set a small rectangular device on the chair arm between them, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket, the kind that looked in a waiting room at midnight like nothing in particular. Everything from 11:52 to 12:14, he said. Clear audio, every word. Jonathan looked at it without picking it up. What are you asking me? He said. I'm not asking you anything, Daniel said. I'm telling you it exists. What you do with that is your decision. He paused. What I do with my story is mine. But a story with institutional backing lands differently than one without it. I'm not asking you to be a source. I'm asking whether you think what I have is something this hospital has an interest in being on the right side of. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment, at the canvas jacket, the shoulder bag, the particular steadiness of a person who had decided a long time ago what kind of work they were going to do and had made their peace with what it cost. He thought about the folders upstairs, about Dr. Osei's voice adjusting from sleep to precision in 2 sentences, about a letter sitting in his desk drawer that was going to matter in a room where decisions got made. He thought about a waiting room, about 43 people Daniel had documented, and 31 appeals upheld on denial, and a word a careful physician had used, window, in the specific way that word gets used when it is not a metaphor. He said, the hospital has an interest in being on the right side of this. Daniel nodded, not with satisfaction the nod of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has just found a place to set part of it down. He reached over and picked up the recording device. He turned it once in his hand. Then he slid it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, and his hand came out empty. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The lobby moved around them, morning arrivals through the main entrance, a family toward the elevators, a custodian along the far wall, with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose work does not pause for the conversations happening inside it. Daniel stood. They shook hands, not a formality, the specific grip of 2 people who have agreed on something neither of them will be putting in writing. He adjusted the strap of his bag. He walked to the main doors without announcement, without urgency, the way a person moves when the most important part of what they came to do has already been done. At the doors, he paused for half a second, not looking back, just orienting to the street outside before stepping into it. Then he was gone. He didn't go back to his office. He had meant to. There were calls to return, and a board notification to draft, and a calendar, full of the kind of morning that does not wait for a person to finish processing the night before. But he had stood in the lobby after Daniel left and looked at the elevator bank for a long moment, and then he had turned and walked in the other direction. Rebecca was still there, same chair, same position. Lily, against her left side, one arm around her daughter's shoulders, bag on the floor, with the strap looped around her ankle. She had not slept. Jonathan could tell by the quality of her stillness, the wakeful kind maintained deliberately, through an act of ongoing will rather than arrived at through rest. She looked up when he approached. Her expression did not shift toward warmth or toward wariness, simply opened the steady attention of a person who had learned to read what people actually were rather than what they presented. He sat down, not directly beside her, one chair between them, the automatic courtesy of a person who understood that proximity was something you offered rather than assumed. Outside, the rain had lost the force it carried at midnight. The storm was moving through rather than settling in, and the sound against the glass had changed from the hard driving percussion of the night before to something lower and steadier weather that had made its point and was now simply finishing what it started. Jonathan said, "How is she?" Rebecca said, "Still warm, in and out." A pause. Dr. Osei's team called about an hour ago. They said the surgery has been moved to a priority schedule. She looked at him with the attention of someone who has received unexpected information and is deciding how to receive it. "That was you." It wasn't a question. Jonathan said the reclassification was medically indicated. Dr. Osei agreed. Rebecca was quiet. When she looked back at him, her expression had not shifted toward gratitude, and it had not shifted toward suspicion. Something more careful than either. She said, "What do you want?" Jonathan said, "I want to ask you something. Answer it the way you'd answer it if I weren't the person I am, and you weren't in the position you're in." He paused. What do you actually need? The question sat between them. She had been asked variations of this before, by caseworkers, by social workers, by well-meaning people who looked at her circumstances and concluded that what she needed was to be pointed toward a resource. The question had always arrived with an answer already attached, waiting to be confirmed. This one didn't. She said, I don't need to be rescued. Jonathan said, I didn't offer that. She looked at him. Then she said, people see the scrubs in the situation, and they think they understand what's needed. They think what's needed is for someone to come in and fix things. No heat in it, the way you describe something you have observed many times and stopped being surprised by. I don't need fixing. I need the system I work inside to work the way it's supposed to. Jonathan waited. I need a surgery approved because a 5-year-old needs it, not because someone made a phone call. She paused. I need a shift request submitted 7 months ago to be reviewed because it was submitted. I need the things that were supposed to happen. Another pause, shorter. That's all. That's everything. The room held that for a moment. Jonathan said, why nursing? You could have gone a different direction. There are easier ways to be inside the system you're describing. Rebecca looked at Lily, at the slow rise and fall of her chest, at the way her fingers had finally loosened their grip on the scrub top in deeper sleep. The hand lying open, now palm up, the relaxation of a child who had decided somewhere below consciousness that it was safe to let go. She said, 2 years ago, there was a boy in treatment room 7, 8 years old. He came in not doing well, and his mother stepped out, and the situation got more serious before it got better. Factual, no decoration. The way a person describes something they have processed fully and no longer need to dramatize. I stayed with him 2 hours past the end of my shift, talked to him about whatever came to mind until he went back to sleep, and I was certain he was going to be all right. She looked at Jonathan. I didn't stay because I wanted something. I didn't stay because it was in my job description. A pause. No performance in it, just the space a person leaves when the next thing they say is the most important thing. I stayed because he was scared, and because his mother had already left the room. Jonathan did not move. He sat with what she had said. The way you sit with something placed in your hands with more weight than you expected. Carefully, making sure you have it before you try to do anything with it. The sentence stayed in the room. Not because it was complicated, because it was so simple that the full weight of it took a moment to arrive completely. Outside, the rain had gone quieter still. The last of the storm was moving through, leaving the street below washed clean, and the windows beginning to clear. The sound against the glass was barely there, and then it wasn't. 1 week is not a long time. In the life of a hospital, a week is approximately 400 decisions, 60 scheduling conflicts, 20 equipment issues, and at least one conversation with a board member that requires more diplomacy than the situation deserves. In the life of an insurance company under investigation, a week is something else entirely. The article ran on a Wednesday. Daniel Cho's byline appeared above the fold in the print edition of the Chicago Tribune, and at the top of the publication's digital front page, a detailed, carefully sourced account of 18 months of claim denials at one of Illinois' largest private insurance providers. It named figures. It cited documentation. It included statements from 11 patients whose appeals had been denied, 4 physicians who had treated those patients, and 3 former employees of the company who had agreed to speak on the condition that their names not be used. It did not include the recording from the waiting room. It did not need to. The story did not spread the way things spread when they are designed to spread through the engineered momentum of a publicity campaign or the calculated timing of a corporate announcement. It spread the way things spread when they are true, and people recognize them as true because they have been living inside the truth of them for a long time, without anyone putting it in print. It moved through the circles of people who read about healthcare policy, and the circles of people who worked in healthcare, and the much larger circle of people who had at some point in their lives received a letter in a plain white envelope that told them the thing they needed did not meet the criteria. By Thursday morning, 3 other regional publications had picked up the story. By Friday, The Illinois Department of Insurance had opened a formal inquiry. The 340 files that Marcus Webb had assembled were not, in the end, just a stack of folders. They were a pattern. Jonathan's legal team spent 4 days going through them, cross-referencing denial dates against the reviewing physicians on record, mapping the stated reasons for denial against the actual clinical documentation submitted, tracking the gap between what the patient's doctors had recommended and what the company's reviewers had concluded. The pattern that emerged was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that is only invisible when no one has taken the time to look at all the pieces in the same room at the same time. Marcus presented the findings on a Thursday afternoon in the same conference room where Jonathan had read Daniel's email 6 days earlier. He laid it out the way good lawyers lay things out, without editorializing, without drama in the flat, and careful language of someone who understands that the facts presented clearly and in sequence are more damaging than any commentary that could be added to them. Jonathan listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Jonathan said, "Send it to the state attorney's office. All of it. Every file, every cross-reference, the full analysis." He paused. "And copy the Department of Insurance." Marcus said he would have it out by end of day. Richard Hargrove appeared before the Illinois Joint Committee on Health Insurance Practices on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the article ran. He arrived with 4 lawyers and a prepared statement that had clearly been written by people whose primary concern was limiting the number of words that could later be used in a different context. He read it carefully and answered questions in the specific way of a person who has been advised to answer questions completely enough to avoid contempt, incompletely enough to avoid anything worse. The committee members were not satisfied. The hearing lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, 2 committee members had called publicly for a full audit of the company's claim review process going back 3 years. A third had used the phrase systematic denial twice in the same question, without apparent concern for whether the phrasing was prejudicial. Richard Hargrove left through a side entrance. His name was not mentioned at Mercy General that day, not in any meeting, not in any hallway conversation that Jonathan was part of. There was no announcement. There was no statement. The hospital did not issue a press release or hold a staff briefing or do any of the things institutions do when they want to be seen doing something. The work simply continued. The floors kept running. The overnight shifts kept turning over. The waiting room kept receiving whoever came through its doors, and the lights inside it stayed on at full brightness, the way they always had, because the people who needed that building needed it to be there completely, without conditions, attached the same at midnight as at noon. The new contract arrived on Jonathan's desk on a Monday. It was from a regional provider that had spent the past decade building a reputation for claim approval rates that were, according to every metric, Jonathan's team had reviewed significantly above the industry standard. The language in their coverage policies was direct rather than deliberately ambiguous. Their appeals process had a documented average resolution time of 11 days. Jonathan read through the contract the way he read things that mattered from the beginning, without skipping giving each section what it required. He read the coverage criteria. He read the appeals language. He read the section that outlined the process for cases flagged as medical priority. He picked up the pen. He signed his name on the indicated line with the unhurried movement of a man who has been waiting 3 weeks to make a decision and has just arrived finally at the one that was always the right one. He set the pen down. He closed the folder. Outside his office window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November. Bare trees along the boulevard, catching the last of the afternoon light, the lake visible in the distance as a thin, gray line where the sky met the water. Ordinary, functional. The city going about the business of being a city, indifferent to the specific weight of the moment happening 4 floors above it. Jonathan looked at the signed folder on his desk for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Osei's extension. 2 weeks later, the hallway outside Surgical Suite 4 had the particular quality that certain hallways in certain buildings only have when something important is happening behind a closed door. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply a hallway, linoleum floors, buffed to a low shine, a row of chairs along one wall, a water fountain at the far end that made a small sound every few minutes, whether anyone used it or not. The overhead lights were the practical shadowless kind that hospitals use in working areas, the kind that exist to be useful rather than to create atmosphere. Rebecca had been sitting in the third chair from the left for 40 minutes. She was not in her scrubs. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, the kind of clothes you put on when you are going somewhere that requires you to be a person rather than a function, and you want to remember that distinction. Her hair was down. She had slept 7 hours the night before, which was more than she had slept in a single stretch longer than she could accurately calculate, and the sleep had not made her feel rested so much as it had made her feel like herself again. The version of herself that existed underneath the shifts, in the scheduling, in the ongoing mathematics of making everything work. She had her hands in her lap, not folded, not gripped together, just resting there open, the way hands rest when the person they belong to has decided that there is nothing left to do but wait and has made a kind of peace with the waiting. The door to Surgical Suite 4 had been closed for 2 hours and 19 minutes. Dr. Osei had come out once, briefly, at the 90-minute mark, not with news, just the quiet appearance of a physician checking the hallway, the way you check on someone, without wanting to make the checking into an event. She had looked at Rebecca. She had given a small, contained nod, the nod of a person who is not ready to say anything definitive, but wants the other person to know that the situation is being managed by someone who takes the management of it seriously. Then she had gone back in. Rebecca had received the nod the way it was intended. She had taken a breath. She had put her hands back in her lap. She was looking at the door when she heard footsteps in the hallway behind her. Not the brisk, purposeful footsteps of the surgical floor. The floor had its own rhythm, and she knew it had spent enough years moving through it that she could read the pace of someone's walk the way other people read expressions. These were slower, not uncertain, deliberate, the specific pace of someone who had somewhere to be and had decided that arriving at the right speed mattered more than arriving quickly. She did not turn around. The footsteps stopped. There was the sound of a jacket, settling the slight shift of weight from standing to sitting. Jonathan Marsh sat down in the chair 2 away from hers, the same instinctive distance he had chosen in the waiting room, the same understanding that space was something offered rather than assumed. He did not speak. She did not speak. They sat in the hallway, outside Surgical Suite, 4 the way 2 people sit when they have already said the things that matter, and understand that what is required now is not more words, but simply presence, the plain and unglamorous fact of another person in the same space, willing to be there for however long the being there takes. The water fountain at the end of the hall made its small sound. Somewhere on the floor below, an elevator opened and closed. Rebecca looked at the door. Jonathan looked at the door. The overhead lights did what they were designed to do, which was illuminate the hallway evenly and without opinion, indifferent to what was happening in the room behind the door or the hallway in front of it. 31 minutes passed. Rebecca counted them, the way she counted things that mattered, not obsessively, not with anxiety, but with the steady attention of a person who has learned that paying close attention to something is a form of respect for it. Each minute was its own complete thing. She let them be complete. At the 32nd minute, something changed. The light above the door to Surgical Suite 4, a small indicator panel mounted at eye level, the kind that shows the room's operational status, shifted. The amber that had been burning steadily for 2 hours and 50 minutes went out, not gradually, the way a held breath releases all at once, and then the change of pressure in the room. Rebecca's hands, which had been resting open in her lap, closed, just slightly. The automatic closing of hands that belonged to a person whose body has understood something a half second before the rest of her has caught up. Beside her, Jonathan had gone still, in the way of a person who is paying complete attention and wants nothing about his presence to interrupt whatever is about to happen. The door opened. Dr. Amara Ose stepped into the hallway. She was still in her surgical attire, cap gown, the particular composed exhaustion of a person who has just finished doing something difficult with great care and is now on the other side of it. She pulled down her mask as she walked toward Rebecca, and the motion revealed her face, and her face did the thing that faces do when the news is good and the person delivering it has been holding it carefully for the duration of the procedure and is now finally allowed to let it show. She smiled, not a small professional smile, the real kind, the kind that starts somewhere behind the eyes and arrives on the face, last unhurried because it doesn't need to be managed. November in Chicago arrives without asking. One morning, the trees along the boulevard still have most of their leaves, and the next morning, they don't. And the city adjusts the way it always adjusts, by putting on another layer and continuing. The light changes too. It comes in lower, at a different angle, the way afternoon light comes in through a window. You've looked through 100 times, and suddenly illuminates a corner of the room you had stopped noticing. Rebecca noticed it the morning she walked back through the emergency waiting room for the first time since October. It was a Tuesday, 7:43 in the morning. She was coming in for the 7 to 3 shift, the evening shift that had appeared on the scheduling system 6 weeks ago, processed through the standard review queue, approved without ceremony or announcement. The way things get approved when someone finally looks at a request that has been sitting in a system for 7 months and finds no reason to deny it. She had taken it the way it was offered, without performance, without the urge to explain what it meant to her, to the people who had processed it as paperwork. She came through the main entrance, rather than the staff entrance, on the north side, which added approximately 40 seconds to her route, and took her through the lobby and past the corridor that opened into the emergency department's waiting area. She had not planned it. She had simply walked toward the building, the way she always walked toward it directly, without detour, and the route had brought her here. She stopped at the entrance to the waiting room. Not for long, just long enough to look. The room was different at 7:43 in the morning than it was at midnight. The quality of light was the first thing, not the sealed, self-sufficient brightness of a room that had cut itself off from the outside world and was running entirely on its own supply, but actual daylight coming in through the 2 windows on the east wall that she had forgotten existed because she had never been in this room when they had anything to offer. The light fell across the linoleum in long rectangles and caught the dust in the air and made the whole space look for the first time in her experience of it like a room that was part of a building, that was part of a city, that was part of a morning. The chairs were the same. The check-in desk was the same. Carla was there, head down, over her keyboard, the practiced focus of a woman who understood that the early shift set the pace for everything that followed. The television on the wall was cycling through a morning news program, the volume set at the same indeterminate level it had always been set at, loud enough to fill the silence without being loud enough to follow. The people in the chairs were different people. A young woman with a wrapped hand filling out paperwork with her good one. An older man reading a folded newspaper with the focused attention of someone who still believed that the physical paper was worth the effort of holding. A father with a small boy on his lap, the boy turning a toy car over and over in his hands, examining it from every angle with the complete absorption that children bring to objects that adults stopped really looking at a long time ago. Rebecca looked at them the way she looked at every waiting room, gathering information, reading what was there. The woman with the wrapped hand was managing well. The older man was not in acute distress. The small boy was not sick. He had the color and the fidget of a child who was here because someone else needed to be here, and who was making the best of it with a toy car, and the patience of a father who was holding him carefully and letting him turn the car as many times as he needed to. An ordinary Tuesday morning in an emergency waiting room. She thought about the last time she had sat in those chairs, about the letter she had been holding, about the weight of it, not the physical weight, the piece of paper itself weighed almost nothing, but the other weight, the weight of what it represented, the particular heaviness of a thing that stands between a person and something they need and cannot reach. That weight was different now, not gone. The surgery had addressed what it had addressed, and the shift had opened when it had opened, and the application to the nurse practitioner program was in the system, submitted on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks ago at her kitchen table after Lily was asleep. The $85 fee paid from money she had set aside over 2 weeks by adjusting one line item in a budget that did not have a lot of lines to adjust. She had submitted it and closed the laptop and gone to bed. She had not told anyone. It was hers, and it was in, and that was enough. The weight was different because the things that needed to change had changed. Not because of any single person's intervention, not because someone had decided she deserved special consideration, but because someone had finally looked at the parts of the system that had stopped working the way they were supposed to, and had treated the not working as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be managed. That was all she had ever asked for. She stood in the entrance to the waiting room for another moment, long enough to let the morning light do what it was doing, filling the corners, clarifying the surfaces, making the room look like what it actually was, which was a place where people came when they needed help, and which existed to give it to them, without conditions, without tears, without the careful calibration of who deserved how much of what, a place that was supposed to work a certain way. And now, in the ways that mattered, it was working that way again. She looked at the room one more time, at the chairs, at the light, at the small boy, turning his toy car over in his hands, with complete and uncomplicated absorption. Then she turned and walked to the staff entrance and swiped her badge and stepped through into the part of the building where her shift was waiting. She had not changed which hospital she worked in. She had not changed which floor. She had not changed the badge she wore, or the scrubs she put on, or the way she moved through a room, or the reason she had chosen a long time ago to be in these rooms at all. She had never been the one who needed to change. The door closed behind her, and the morning continued. I stayed because he was scared, and because his mother had already left the room. That sentence does not belong to a story. It belongs to a life, the kind of life that does not get documented in quarterly reports or recognized at annual galas or written about in the sections of newspapers that people read first. It belongs to the 2 a.m. shifts and the hallways that smell like antiseptic and recycled air, and the small, specific decision a person makes when they are tired and their shift is technically over, and there is a child in a room who is frightened and alone, and the easiest thing, the entirely defensible, no one would blame you thing, would be to go home. She stayed, not for recognition, not for reward, not because anyone was watching, or because she believed that staying would one day be returned to her in some measurable form. She stayed because it was the right thing to do, and she was the person in the room, and that was enough of a reason. We talk a great deal, in the world we live in, about people who do big things. The announcements and the press releases and the names on the sides of buildings. These are the things that get remembered, the things that get written down. And there is nothing wrong with big things. Big things matter. The world needs people who do them. But there is another kind of doing, quieter, less visible, the kind that happens in rooms where no one is keeping score, at hours when most of the world is asleep, between people whose names will never appear in the same sentence in any public record. The kind of doing that does not announce itself, because it does not need to, because the person doing it is not performing goodness, they are simply being it in the way that God intended for us to be, it in the ordinary and unremarkable and profoundly important moments of ordinary life. The waiting room taught us something about silence. There is a silence that protects the person who keeps it, the silence of the man who glances over and looks away, of the woman who turns her child toward the wall of the manager, who smiles with the right shape, but without warmth and asks if there might be a more convenient lane. That silence is understandable. It is human. Most of us have stood inside it at least once, on one side or the other, and we know what it costs to break it, and we know what it costs to keep it, and neither cost is nothing. But there is another silence, the silence of a person who has been spoken to with cruelty in a room full of people and has chosen not to answer, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have decided that some things are worth protecting from the thing that wants to diminish them, and that the best protection is not exposure, but the quiet, absolute dignity of refusing to be moved. That kind of silence is not weakness. That kind of silence is in the truest sense of the word strength, the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself, the kind that God sees even when no one else in the room is looking. And then there are the people who break the other silence, the ones who set something down, a basket, a pen, a coffee cup, and stand up, not because they are heroes, not because they have calculated the cost and found it acceptable, but because they were raised by someone who scrubbed floors and came home and made dinner and never once said, "This is not my problem," about a thing that was happening to another person in front of them, because they learned early and well that the question is never whether you saw it. The question is what you did after you saw it. We do not always get to choose the rooms we end up in. We do not always get to choose the hour or the circumstances or the other people who happen to be present. We do not get to schedule the moments when we will be asked, not by anyone out loud, but by the situation itself, by the simple fact of being present when something is happening, what kind of person we are going to be. What we get to choose is what we do in those moments. And here is what the waiting room taught us about that the choice is almost never dramatic. It almost never arrives as a clear and obvious fork in the road with signs pointing in both directions. It arrives the way most important things arrive, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment, in a room you did not plan to be in, at an hour you did not expect to matter. It arrives as a cup set down on a floor, as a letter unfolded in two careful hands, as 5 words said to a frightened woman at 2 a.m. by someone whose shift had already ended. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving." God places us in rooms for reasons we do not always understand in the moment. He places us beside people whose stories we do not yet know, in circumstances that seem ordinary, until they suddenly aren't at hours when we would rather be anywhere else. And in those moments, He is not asking us to be extraordinary. He is asking us to be present, to see what is in front of us, to make the choice that the person who raised us, or the person we are trying to become, would recognize as the right one. That is not a small ask, but it is the ask. If this story found you today, it did not find you by accident. Maybe you are the person in the waiting room who needed to hear that your dignity does not depend on whether anyone in that room chooses to defend it. Maybe you are the person in the corner chair who has been watching something happen and has not yet stood up. Maybe you are somewhere in between, carrying something you have not told anyone about, waiting for a system to work the way it was supposed to, staying in rooms long past the hour when leaving would have been easier. Whoever you are, in whatever room you are sitting in right now, you are not invisible. The work you do in the dark is not lost. The staying when staying costs something is not wasted. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone who stayed when they could have left, who spoke when it would have been easier to be quiet, who did the right thing in a room where no one important was watching, share it with that person. Not tomorrow, today, because the people who show up for us in the hard hours deserve to know that we remember. Leave a comment below and tell us what is the smallest act of kindness someone did for you that you never forgot. The thing that cost them almost nothing and gave you everything. And one more thing before you go. Think about the last waiting room you sat in. Not necessarily a hospital. Any room where you were waiting for something that mattered, carrying something heavy, hoping that the situation would resolve the way it was supposed to. Think about who was in that room with you. Think about what they did and what they didn't do. and what you did, and what you didn't do. And then ask yourself the question the waiting room is always asking, in every city, at every hour, under every kind of light. You never know who is sitting in that waiting room. You never know what they're carrying, but you always know what you choose to do when you see it.